We are continuing with the story of Egypt and the Coptic people in Egypt. We have reached the 7th century of the Arab invasion of Egypt in 639, 641. And under the rule of Khalifa Omar, the Egyptians actually in the first years after the Arab takeover, the Coptic Egyptians didn't care who ruled the country so long that they were free to worship and to have a free religion and to work and to not be persecuted for their beliefs. They did not care who was in power. They did not actually demand a lot of things. Khalifa Omar actually in the first years of his rule of Egypt was very just. The money that they collected from the people, the jizya, they were actually put forth to improve the quality of life in Egypt. The canals were built, roads were made safer, new roads were created, infrastructure was upkept. A lot of actually upkeep for the country took place. It was a sort of an investment for the Arabs to upkeep Egypt and to keep the people in Egypt happy, so they afforded them their freedom of religion. There was no persecution early on, and the worship was guaranteed to whomever wanted to worship in their churches. No churches were torn down early on. There was no confliction or there was no persecution to Egyptians at the time, at the early stages of the Arab invasion of Egypt. The only thing that a certain incident happened was there was a man called John or Ioannis that actually asked Amr Ibn Alas when he settled Egypt and everything was in his hands, to afford him the library of Egypt. He told him, well, you have everything under your hands, why don't you give us back the library of Egypt, which was actually in Alexandria at the time, which was one of the biggest libraries in the world that housed a lot of manuscripts and the books and all the sciences of the combined humanity at the time, because Alexandria was one of the major hubs in the world. Well, he told him, well, this is not mine. I have to ask my Khalifa Omar if I could give it to you or not. So after corresponding with Omar, he sent him a letter asking him, well, we have this huge library that contains so many manuscripts and so many books, and the people of the country are asking for it. What do we do? Omar's answer was very straightforward and very clear. If these books contain sciences that contradict the Quran, well, you know what, we don't need it, destroy it. And if it contains information and sciences that agree with the Quran, well, we have the Quran, so we don't need it anyways, destroy it. And so the library of Alexandria was dismantled and all the manuscripts and books were given to the local baths to use in heating the water. It was mentioned by several historians that these manuscripts and books kept the local baths fires on for about 6 months. And we can all imagine how much sciences and technologies and history was lost to humanity by this act. After the invasion of Egypt and taking over Egypt, it didn't stop there. Actually, Egypt was just the premise and actually just the first step in taking over northern Africa, Nubia and Sudan and other countries from the Byzantine Empire or the Roman Empire. The Pentapolis that we mention always in our sermon, in our prayers, is actually all the 5 cities in northern Africa that was actually invaded early on by Amr Ibn Alas and the generals that came with him through Egypt. That didn't take long actually. In the years that followed, it was they were very less garrisoned by the Romans. There was no much resistance offered after that in northern Africa. After Omar ibn Khattab, Osman ibn Affan took over the Caliphate after Omar was murdered. And following that, the Umayyad dynasty started. We have to mention the Pope at that time was Benjamin I. Benjamin I was the Pope that was there from emperor focus to after the Arab invasion. Benjamin I spent most of his papacy in hiding, first from under the persecution of the Romans and the Chalcedonian heresy, or the Chalcedonian council that started the Diaphysite-Miaphysite division and the persecution by the Roman Byzantine Church, followed by the Arab invasion. Actually, he came out of hiding and came out of his hiding after Amr Ibn Alas gave him his word that there was no more persecution for his church and he could come out of his hiding and assume his position. Actually, that dealt a huge blow to the Byzantine Church, that the Coptic national church was declared the original national official church of Egypt. The Byzantine Pope did not stay in Egypt at the time. They stayed at Constantinople, and for 60 or more years there was no pope for the Byzantine Church or Melkite Church in Egypt, up until after the Arab invasion, so many years after the year 661. Continuing the invasion of Egypt by the Arabs and the takeover of Egypt by the Arabs, we reached that Khalifa Omar was assassinated, and Khalifa Osman Ibn Affan came at the year 644. Then he was followed, also was assassinated, and was taken over. The caliphate was taken over by the Umayyad dynasty. At the time, there was again the conflict between the Egyptian national Coptic Pope and the Byzantine Roman Melkite Church. The Egyptian Pope at the time, Pope Benjamin, had passed away, and Pope Agathon, the 39th Pope of Alexandria, came to power in 661. Pope Agathon was sainted by the Coptic Church afterwards. He was one of the followers of Pope Benjamin, and he was also persecuted by the Byzantine Church and the Byzantine Pope. At the time, his name was Theodosius. He threatens him severely, and he told him that he would be murdered if he came out of his hiding. At the time, Egypt was under the Muslim rule, and the Byzantine Melkite Pope Theodosius was collecting, or was levying, a lot of money from the national church, to the point that the national church didn't have any money to spend on the churches and on the people. This lifelong struggle ended when Agathon decided, well, to go to the Muslim authority, and actually appealed to the Muslim authorities at the time. And this situation was actually rectified immediately. And when Pope Agathon got back his church, and the national pope was declared the only pope of Egypt at the time. Amr Ibn Alas did not remain the ruler of, or the governor of Egypt under the Muslim flag at the time. The Umayyad dynasty took over, and Amr Ibn Alas was reinstated again in his position according to popular demand from the Egyptians. They knew his rule. He was a fair ruler, and he came back again to Egypt in 660. After Pope Agathon, Pope John III came to the See of St. Mark, and the Khalifa Marwan ibn al-Hakam was the Khalifa of the Muslim world at the time. He tried to collect more money from Egypt, and by doubling the jizya, or the surtax on the Egyptians, he collected more money. That was against the advice of Amr ibn Alas, who knew the people and he knew their capabilities. He did not want to overtax the Egyptians and overtax the clergy at the time. To close off this century, it was not all black and white actually in Egypt. There was a lot of grays, meaning that there was a lot of people who sided with the Muslim invaders, or the Muslim people, or the Muslim Arabs that came from Arabia, basically for several reasons: their own interests, for not paying the surtax, for not paying jizya, for avoiding persecution, for many other reasons. There was a lot of revolts, which was not like something that the people of Egypt accepted the Muslims directly and all the time, contrary to the common beliefs that the Copts were well accepting of the Muslims. This is not true. The Copts of Egypt revolted several times. One of the most important was the Bashmurian revolts, which happened in the northern part of the country in the Delta area, in Damietta and Manzala in the Nile Delta. They revolted against the Muslim and the Arab invaders and the collection of the jizya, and they stopped paying the surtax and they started killing the soldiers. Many forces were sent, like the garrisons were sent against them to quell this revolt, and they were also driven away. Needless to say that by sending more troops, because the Egyptians were never taking part in actually the conflicts, they were not well trained, they were not capable of resisting the forces that came to Egypt, whether it's from the Romans or from the Arabs or from the Persians. They were never soldiers. Many revolts were put down and quelled. The Muslims sent 2,000 soldiers, and actually the Bashmurian revolt was quelled in the cities in the northern part of the country. This century ends by two popes, Pope Isaac and Pope Simeon. Only one incident or one fact remains to be mentioned, is that Pope Simeon that started collecting money for services in the church, and he is like the ones who started this habit of simony. Simony, according to his name, Pope Simeon, he was originally a Syrian pope, a Syrian by origin, but by birth. He was the 42nd Pope of Alexandria, and due to the pressure that the Arabs exercised against him and against the church, that he needed to collect the money, so he started collecting money for certain services in the church: baptisms, marriages, anything that has to do with the church and clergy, and even for positions that were given to appoint or anoint a bishop or a priest or any position in the church. He started charging money for that and collecting money to pay off the amounts required by the rulers. That this habit started taking root in the church. And with that, we close off the 7th century and the invasion of Egypt by the Arabs. Thank you.